Mothers in Mayfair do not love their daughters. They appraise them. Bryony knew her exact value on the marriage mart before she turned 16. Too tall, too sharp, and possessing a steady gaze that made men shift in their polished boots. Her mother called her plain and proud, a fatal combination in a society built on silk and submission. But the Duke of Hawkhurst wasn't looking for a decorative vase to sit in his parlour. He needed a fortress. Porcelain clinked against silver, the sharp, solitary sound echoing in the morning room as Lady Agatha Reyes conducted her daily inspection. The morning light was unforgiving. It spilled through the tall sash windows of their rented townhouse, highlighting the threadbare patches on the Turkish rug and the faint yellow water stains near the cornices. Mostly, however, the light highlighted Christie. Christie stood in the dead centre of the room, her spine rigid, breathing in shallow, calculated sips of air. Her corset was laced so tightly Bryony could hear the whalebone groan with every exhale. Christie's hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white, her thumbs digging nervously into the delicate flesh of her own palms. "Your posture, Christie," Agatha said, setting her teacup down with a sharp click that made the younger girl flinch. "You look like a frightened rabbit. Men of means do not want rabbits. They want swans. You are drooping. Swans do not droop." Bryony sat by the unlit hearth, methodically mending a tear in a pair of white evening gloves. She didn't look up from her needlework. "Swans are notoriously vicious, Mother. They hiss and bite. Perhaps a rabbit is entirely safer for the gentlemen of the ton." Agatha's gaze snapped toward the hearth. The older woman's face was drawn, deeply lined with an exhaustion that makeup could no longer disguise. "I did not ask for your commentary, Bryony. If you had half your sister's sense, you would be standing beside her, practicing your curtsy instead of lurking in the shadows like a neglected governess." Bryony tied off the silk thread, snipped the end with a small pair of iron shears, and set the glove on her lap. "My curtsy is perfectly adequate. It bends at the knee and dips at the waist. I simply see no reason to rehearse submission in an empty room." "And that," Agatha said, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper, "is why you are 23, and entirely unwanted." The words were meant to sting, but Bryony had built calluses over that particular wound years ago. The insult landed flat, like a stone dropped into dry dirt. She understood her mother's cruelty for what it was. Sheer, unadulterated panic. Lord Reyes had died 3 years prior, leaving behind a legacy of staggering gambling debts, a crumbling estate in Somerset with a leaking roof, and a name that was rapidly losing its luster. Agatha was not a monster. She was a terrified widow trying to keep her daughters out of a debtor's prison. She was steering a sinking ship, and Christie was the only lifeboat. Christie was blonde, petite, and pliable, everything the marriage mart demanded. Bryony, conversely, was tall, dark-haired, with a strong, square jaw, and eyes the colour of damp earth. She lacked the soft, simpering quality that men required in order to feel large and important. Agatha approached Bryony, the faint scent of stale lavender water and anxiety rolling off her in waves. She inspected Bryony's gown, a muted sage-green muslin that had been washed too many times and let out at the hem to accommodate her height. "Plain and proud," Agatha muttered, touching the fabric with obvious disdain, her fingers rubbing the cheap material. "You have no fortune, Bryony. You have no extraordinary beauty. The very least you could do is pretend to be agreeable." "I am agreeable to agreeable people," Bryony replied calmly. "I simply refuse to smile at Lord Hastings when he spits while he speaks, or pretend Mr. Cavendish is a wit when he has the intellect of a root vegetable." Agatha let out a ragged, exhausted breath, pressing 2 fingers to her temples. "We have 3 weeks of the season left. 3 weeks? The creditors are writing twice a week now. The butcher cut off our credit yesterday. If Christie does not secure a match by the end of the month, we will be forced to retreat to Somerset and live on boiled cabbage and pride. You will not ruin this for her, Bryony. Tonight, at the Haringgrove ball, you will stand by the wall. You will not scowl. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will blend in. Bryony looked at her sister. Christie was staring straight ahead, a single tear cutting a track through the chalky powder applied to her cheeks to hide a dusting of summer freckles. "I will be entirely invisible, Mother," Bryony said softly, picking up the second torn glove. "You have my word." Carriages lined up along the damp cobblestones of Grosvenor Square, a crawling serpent of black lacquer, golden crests, and restless, steaming horses. The air inside the Reyes' rented hackney was suffocating. Christie gnawed on the inside of her cheek until Agatha reached over and slapped her wrist with a sharp crack. "Do not mar your face," Agatha hissed. "You are biting your lip raw. Smile, a pleasant, empty smile." Bryony looked out the window, watching the rain slick the streets, distorting the glow of the gas lamps. She felt a detached numbness settling over her, a familiar armor she wore to these events. The balls were all exactly the same heavy, cloying scent of hothouse lilies and sweating bodies masked by French perfume. The same scraping of violins playing the same frantic waltzes. They entered the Haringgrove ballroom, and the wall of heat and noise hit them instantly. It was a suffocating display of exorbitant wealth. 1,000 beeswax candles burned in massive crystal chandeliers, dripping wax and radiating a sweltering heat. Bryony immediately executed her promise. She faded, while Agatha gripped Christie's arm like a vice and steered her toward a cluster of eligible, vacuous young lords near the punch bowl. Bryony slipped quietly along the perimeter of the room. She navigated the treacherous waters of gossiping dowagers and ambitious debutantes until she found her sanctuary, a small niche near the heavy glass doors leading out to the conservatory. It was poorly lit, entirely unglamorous, and partially obscured by an absurdly large potted fern. It was perfect. She stood in the negative space of the room and watched the transactions take place. It was a meat market, disguised by silk and string quartets. Mothers haggled over settlements under the guise of discussing the weather. Young women plastered desperate, bright smiles on their faces, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, made by men who were utterly unremarkable. It was an exhausting, humiliating performance. Watching it from the shadows, Bryony felt a profound sense of relief that she had been deemed unfit for the stage. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a grand announcement. The butler at the top of the stairs didn't bellow a name, but a ripple went through the crowd all the same. Algernon Turner, Duke of Hawkhurst, had arrived. He slipped through a side archway, looking nothing like the shimmering aristocrats that populated the dance floor. He looked like a man wading through thick mud. He was 30, perhaps slightly older. He didn't possess the flawless, symmetrical beauty of the young peacocks preening for the ladies. His face was harsh, angular, and deeply lined around the mouth and eyes, carrying the distinct pallor of a man who spent his time locked in parliamentary debates rather than riding for pleasure in Hyde Park. He wore stark, uncompromising black. No embroidered waistcoats, no excessive cravat pins, no watch fobs swinging from his pocket. Just severe, immaculate tailoring that emphasized the sheer breadth of his shoulders. Bryony watched him navigate the edge of the room. He was dodging. She recognized the maneuver instantly. He moved with a practiced, ruthless evasion, sidestepping Lady Jersey, nodding curtly to a baron, never stopping long enough to be trapped in conversation. His trajectory, she realized with a jolt of annoyance, was leading him straight toward her fern. Bryony didn't move. She expected him to pass by, to seek refuge in the card room. Instead, he stepped directly into the alcove, let out a harsh, ragged breath, and leaned his heavy weight back against the silk-paneled wall, closing his eyes. He didn't realize she was there. For a long moment, Bryony simply observed him. Up close, the sheer exhaustion on his face was startling. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. There was a faint, unmistakable smudge of black ink on his right white linen cuff. A duke with ink on his cuff. How novel! She shifted her weight to ease the ache in her heel. Her silk slipper scraped against the floorboards. His eyes snapped open. They were a startling, piercing grey, the colour of a winter sky right before a storm. He looked down at her, momentarily taken aback, his body tensing as if expecting an ambush. "I apologize," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone that lacked the polished, nasal drawl of the London elite. "I believed this corner to be unoccupied." "It is mostly unoccupied, Your Grace," Bryony said evenly. She did not bother with a deep, sweeping curtsy. A slight nod of her head would suffice in the shadows. "I am merely occupying the negative space." He frowned, his gaze dragging over her. He took in her plain sage dress, her lack of diamonds, and the absolute absence of a simpering, eager smile on her face. "You know who I am. You are the Duke of Hawkhurst. Every woman in this room knows who you are. Most of them have been tracking your movements like hungry hounds since you entered the hall." Algernon sighed, bringing a hand up to pinch the bridge of his nose. "Are they? Christ, I only came tonight because Herringrove holds the swing vote on the Corn Laws Committee." Bryony felt a sudden, involuntary flicker of genuine amusement. "I assure you, Your Grace, the young ladies in this room care very little about the price of domestic grain. They care exclusively about the fact that your estate in Derbyshire allegedly possesses 70 bedrooms. He looked at her sharply, as if waiting for the punchline or the inevitable flutter of eyelashes that usually followed such a statement. When neither came, the rigid tension in his broad shoulders eased a fraction. "It has 64, and most of them are terribly drafty." "I shall pass the tragic news along," Bryony said dryly, keeping her eyes fixed on the crowd. "It may thin the herd." A short, sudden sound escaped his chest. It took a moment for Bryony to realize it was a laugh. It sounded rusty, unused. "Who are you?" "Bryony Reyes, spinster, wallflower, and currently the only thing standing between you and Lady Cowper, who is scanning the room for you with the intensity of a debt collector." Algernon followed her gaze through the fronds of the fern. Lady Cowper was indeed marching through the outer ring of the crowd, looking deadly. "I owe you a debt, Miss Reyes," he muttered, stepping further into the shadow of the alcove to hide himself. The movement brought him uncomfortably close to Bryony. She could smell him now. Not heavy cologne, but plain soap, starched linen, and the cold night air. It was overwhelmingly grounding. "Keep your voice down, Your Grace," she warned quietly. "If my mother spots me speaking to you, she will drag my sister over here and force you into an engagement before you can even reach the door." He looked down at her, his grey eyes catching the dim light of the nearest sconce. "Your sister, Christy. She is beautiful, deeply anxious, and currently being paraded by the refreshment table like a prized mare." Algernon didn't look towards the refreshment table. He kept his eyes on Bryony. He studied her face. The sharp angle of her jaw, the defiant, defensive set of her shoulders, the utter lack of pretense in her posture. And your mother considers you the less dangerous trap?" "My mother considers me plain and proud," Bryony said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. They usually didn't sting, but saying them to this man, in this quiet, enclosed space, felt strangely exposing. Algernon stared at her. His gaze wasn't romantic. It was analytical, sharp, and entirely piercing, slicing right through the heavy velvet of her defenses. "Your mother," he said softly, his voice a low rumble, is a fool. Heat flooded the room, oppressive and heavy, pressing in on the small alcove. The orchestra struck up a new, frantic country dance, the loud, scraping sound masking the sudden, violent thud of Bryony's pulse. She was not used to compliments, though what the Duke had just said felt less like a compliment and more like a statement of undeniable, objective fact. Before she could formulate a suitably detached, cynical reply, the fronds of the fern were violently shoved aside. "There you are, Your Grace." It wasn't Lady Cowper. It was Agatha. Bryony's stomach plummeted to the soles of her worn shoes. Her mother's face was flushed red with triumph, her eyes wide with a terrifying, predatory gleam. Behind her, Christie stood clutching her fan, looking as though she were approaching a guillotine. Algernon straightened instantly. The brief, grounding moment of candor vanished completely, replaced by a cold, impenetrable aristocratic mask. His jaw set, his posture became rigid. "Lady Reyes, I had hoped to see you this evening, Your Grace." Agatha crowed, utterly ignoring Bryony's presence, stepping directly in front of her eldest daughter to monopolize the small space. "May I present my youngest daughter, Miss Christie Reyes? This is her first season." Christie managed a trembling curtsy. She wobbled slightly on her heels. The corset was clearly restricting the blood flow to her brain in the stifling heat of the ballroom. Algernon looked down at Christie. Bryony watched his face carefully from over her mother's shoulder. The men of the ton usually melted into puddles of adoration when Christie looked up at them through her thick, pale lashes. Algernon merely inclined his head, his expression carved from stone. "Miss Reyes, a pleasure." His tone was impeccably polite. It was also completely hollow. Agatha ploughed forward, entirely oblivious to the freezing temperature of the Duke's demeanor. "Christie was just remarking on how much she admires Derbyshire, the hills. She simply loves hills." Christie blinked rapidly, looking terrified. Yes, hills are very elevated." Bryony closed her eyes for a brief, painful second. It was humiliating. The sheer desperation of the display was agonizing to witness. "Derbyshire is mostly jagged rock and damp sheep, Lady Reyes," Algernon said, his voice entirely flat. "It is not for everyone. It requires a certain hardiness." "Oh, Christie adores sheep." Agatha lied shamelessly, pushing Christie a fraction of an inch closer to the Duke. "She is quite hardy." Algernon's gaze drifted over Agatha's feathered turban. He didn't look at Christie. He looked directly at Bryony, who was still trapped in the corner, her back pressed against the silk wall. His grey eyes held a flicker of dark, shared amusement. He was remembering exactly what she had told him about her mother's tactics just 2 minutes prior. Bryony held his gaze. She didn't look away, nor did she lower her eyes demurely, as was expected. For 3 long seconds, while Agatha continued to babble frantically about Christie's exquisite needlework and her proficiency on the pianoforte, Bryony and the Duke of Hawkhurst engaged in an entirely silent, deeply intimate conversation across the small space. "You warned me," his eyes said, bright with dry humor. "I told you to run." Hers replied, softening with quiet apology. The corner of Algernon's mouth twitched. It was barely a millimeter of movement, a fraction of a shadow shifting on his face, but on his rigid, serious features, it was practically a shout. "If you will excuse me, Lady Reyes." Algernon interrupted smoothly, cutting Agatha off mid-sentence and stepping around her with practiced, evasive grace. "I have urgent political matters to discuss with Lord Haringrove. Good evening to you, and to you, Miss Christie." He paused just at the edge of the fern, lingering for a second longer than necessary. He didn't turn back, but his voice dropped an octave, pitched just loud enough so only the occupants of the alcove could hear over the music. "And a very good evening to you, Miss Bryony." He walked away, his broad, dark-clad shoulders cutting a swift swath through the colourful crowd. Agatha stood frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly open. Then she rounded on Bryony, her face a mask of furious, panicked confusion. "Why did he address you? What did you say to him?" "Nothing, Mother," Bryony said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I merely got in his way while he was trying to hide." "You clumsy, stubborn girl!" Agatha hissed, gripping Christie's arm again, her nails biting into the fabric of Christie's sleeve. "You frightened him off with your scowling. You radiated misery. I told you to blend in." Bryony looked out at the retreating back of the Duke. She felt a strange, tight sensation in her chest, a dangerous seed of something she had sworn never to cultivate. Hope, or perhaps merely a profound, intense curiosity. "I blended in perfectly, Mother," Bryony said softly. Across the room, Algernon reached the heavy double doors of the smoking room. Just before he stepped through the threshold, he turned his head. Through the swirling mass of silk and satin, past 100 beautiful, desperate faces, he found the dark corner where the tall, plain girl in the sage-green dress stood. He didn't smile. He just watched her for a long, heavy moment, a look of distinct calculation in his eye, before he finally disappeared into the smoke. Bryony let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mother was already dragging a tearful Christie toward a viscount who had a known penchant for excessive drinking, entirely oblivious to the massive shift in the atmosphere. Agatha was wrong. Bryony hadn't frightened him off. She had done something far more dangerous. She had made him look twice. Morning arrived in the Reyes household, not with the gentle glow of a new day, but with the sharp smell of singed bread and unmitigated dread. Bryony sat at the small, wobbly dining table, methodically scraping the blackened edges off a slice of toast with a dull butter knife. The rain from the previous night had settled into a heavy, pervasive London fog, seeping through the porous brick of their rented townhouse and chilling the room to the bone. Agatha paced the length of the faded Turkish rug. She moved with the frantic, jerky energy of a trapped bird. Her hair was only half pinned, and the silk wrapper she wore was fraying at the cuffs. "The butcher's boy came to the tradesman's entrance at dawn," Agatha announced, her voice tight, hovering dangerously close to hysteria. "He demanded settlement for the month. I had to offer him my garnet brooch just to leave a joint of mutton." Christie sat by the unlit hearth, huddled in a wool shawl, her eyes swollen and red. The Viscount with the drinking problem had abandoned her for a plate of oysters halfway through the supper dance, leaving her stranded near the potted palms. It had been a categorical disaster. "I tried, Mama," Christie whispered, fresh tears pooling in her pale blue eyes. "I smiled until my jaw ached. I laughed at Lord Renfrew's joke about the carriage wheels, even though it made no sense. They just look right past me." "They do not look past you, Christie," Agatha snapped, stopping her pacing to glare at her youngest daughter. "They look at you, and they see a girl with no dowry and a mountain of dead father's debt. You must be more than pretty. You must be indispensable. You must make them feel large." Bryony took a dry bite of her toast. It tasted like ash. "Perhaps if she learned to juggle, Mother, that might hold Lord Renfrew's attention longer than a plate of mollusks." Agatha wheeled on her, a sharp retort dying on her lips as a heavy, resounding knock echoed from the front door. The sound was singular and authoritative. It did not sound like a creditor. Creditors banged rapidly, driven by annoyance. This knock was slow, deliberate, and entirely self-assured. A moment later, their sole maid, a weary girl named Betty, appeared in the doorway holding a tarnished silver salver. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously between the three women. Resting on the center of the tray was a thick, cream-colored calling card. Agatha snatched it. She stared at the crisp black ink, the heavy embossing of the ducal crest. All the blood drained from her face, leaving a stark contrast against the feverish red of her cheeks. "Hawkhurst," she breathed, the word hanging in the cold air. Christie gasped, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The Duke!" "Here. He has come to call," Agatha whispered, a manic, desperate light suddenly igniting in her eyes. The terror of the butcher's boy evaporated, instantly replaced by a blinding, intoxicating delusion. "I knew it! I knew he was looking at you yesterday, Christie, when we were speaking by the fern. He saw your hardiness!" Bryony carefully set down her butter knife. Her heart performed a strange, arrhythmic skip against her ribs. She remembered the Duke's grey eyes, the exhaustion in his posture, the sharp, shared amusement in the negative space of the ballroom. He had not been looking at Christie's hardiness. "Mother," Bryony began softly, a warning note in her voice. "Do not—" "Betty, show him up!" Agatha shrieked, pushing Christie toward the nearest mirror. "Pinch your cheeks, Christie! Put away that horrible wool shawl! Bryony, hide the toast! Dukes, do not look at scraped toast!" There was no time to argue. Heavy, measured footsteps were already ascending the narrow wooden staircase. The floorboards groaned in protest beneath the weight of a man clearly unused to flimsy architecture. Algernon Turner entered the small morning room, and the space immediately shrank. He wore a heavy charcoal riding coat that smelled faintly of cold rain and wet wool, his boots gleaming with black polish that somehow highlighted the scuffed, dirty floorboards of the Reyes parlor. He did not look around with polite disdain, nor did he offer a practiced, aristocratic smile. He stood in the center of the room like a granite monolith, his sharp, intelligent eyes sweeping the space in a single, calculating second. His gaze landed on Bryony. It stopped there. "Your Grace!" Agatha cried, executing a curtsy so deep her knees audibly popped. "We are immensely honored. We did not expect, that is to say, we are delighted." "Lady Reyes." Algernon said, his voice the same low, gravelly rumble from the night before. He bowed his head slightly. "Miss Christie." He turned his full, imposing attention to the corner of the room, where Bryony was standing rigidly by the breakfast table, a cloth napkin clenched tightly in her hand. "Miss Bryony." Agatha fluttered her hands, stepping forcefully into his line of sight, dragging Christie along with her. "Christie was just remarking on the weather, Your Grace. She finds the London fog so atmospheric. Do you not, Christie?" Christie looked as though she might faint. "It is very grey." Algernon looked at Christie for a fraction of a second. It was an objective, entirely bloodless appraisal. Then he looked back at Agatha. "I have not come to discuss the atmosphere with Miss Christie, Lady Reyes," Algernon said flatly, slicing through Agatha's manic energy with the blunt force of a butcher's cleaver. "I have come to request the company of your eldest daughter for a walk in the square, if you have no objections." The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like hammer blows. Agatha's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. She stared at the Duke, then at Bryony, her brain violently rejecting the information it had just received. "Bryony, but Bryony is 23, entirely unwanted and terribly plain." Bryony finished for her, stepping out from behind the table. She looked Algernon dead in the eye, challenging him to deny it. "I believe those were the exact credentials we established yesterday, Your Grace." Algernon did not smile, but a muscle feathered at the hard edge of his jaw. "Put on your coat, Miss Reyes. The damp is unforgiving today." Agatha was paralyzed, torn between the horror of Bryony's bluntness and the sheer staggering reality that a duke was standing in her home, asking for her spinster daughter. "Go!" Agatha hissed finally, a violent shove of sound aimed at Bryony. "Get your police. Do not make him wait." Bryony retrieved her faded green wool coat. She did not bother to check her reflection. There was no point in pretending to be a swan when she was well aware the man waiting for her knew exactly what she was. She tied the ribbons of her bonnet beneath her strong jaw and walked back into the parlour. "I am ready, Your Grace." Algernon offered his arm. Bryony took it. Through the thick wool of his coat, his forearm felt like a steel beam. They walked out of the cramped townhouse, leaving Agatha staring after them in a state of profound, open-mouthed shock. Grosvenor Square was practically deserted. The biting morning chill and the lingering fog had driven the fashionable elite indoors, leaving the damp, leaf-strewn paths to the gardeners and a stray, shivering spaniel. Algernon walked at a measured pace. He did not shorten his stride to accommodate Bryony, forcing her to rely on her long legs to keep up. She appreciated it. It was entirely unromantic and highly practical. They walked in silence for a full 5 minutes. The only sounds were the crunch of wet gravel beneath their boots and the distant rattle of a coal cart on the cobblestones. Bryony let the cold air bite her cheeks, clearing the stench of burnt toast and her mother's desperation from her lungs. "You are causing a scandal, Your Grace," Bryony finally said, not turning her head, keeping her eyes fixed on the grey silhouette of a distant elm tree. "I rarely do anything else," Algernon replied. "The Ton finds my refusal to engage in their parlour games deeply offensive. Then why are you playing one now? Calling upon a ruined baron's spinster daughter in a rented, leaking townhouse is not a political manoeuvre. It is a spectacle." Algernon stopped walking. He turned to face her on the wet path. The fog swirled around his broad shoulders, making him look less like a peer of the realm, and more like a solitary soldier on a miserable watch. "I am not playing a game, Miss Reyes," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of polite distance. "I am 32 years old. I sit on 4 committees in the House of Lords. I manage an estate that employs over 2,000 souls. I have a coal mine in Durham that requires constant, brutal oversight, and a mother in Derbyshire who spends money with the ruthless efficiency of a naval blockade." He took a step closer. The scent of cold air and clean soap wrapped around her. "I do not have the time, the patience, or the inclination to court a terrified child who thinks milk comes from a silver jug." Algernon continued, his grey eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "I do not want a decorative ornament to sit by a fire and embroider slippers. I need a fortress. I need someone who can look at a ledger and not weep. Someone who can sit across from Lady Jersey at a dinner table and not flinch. Someone who understands that life is a mechanism of survival, not a sonnet." Bryony stared at him. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent her entire adult life being told she was too hard, too sharp, too practical. She was an unyielding rock in a world that demanded soft clay. And here stood the Duke of Hawkhurst, looking at her as though her stone was exactly the material he needed to build a wall. "You are asking for an estate manager," Bryony said, her voice a dry rasp. She fought the urge to step back. "You should place an advertisement in the Times." "I am asking for a wife," Algernon countered, refusing to let her deflect. "Because an estate manager cannot secure my lineage, nor can an estate manager force the society matrons to stop circling my properties like vultures. I need a Duchess. But more importantly, I need a partner." Bryony's chest tightened. Cynicism was her armor, but Algernon Turner was holding a very large, very heavy hammer, and he was striking directly at the rivets. "Why me?" she asked, stripping away the sarcasm, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. "You saw me for 5 minutes in a dark corner. You know nothing of me, save that I am rude and my mother is desperate. I saw a woman who stood in a room full of the most powerful people in England and refused to bend her knee to their absurdity." Algernon said softly, I saw a woman who watched her mother humiliate herself, and instead of crumbling, shielded her sister with her own pride. I saw someone who looked at me, a man most women view as a walking vault of gold, and saw only a tired man trying to hide behind a fern. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and touched the rough wool of her sleeve. The contact was slight, but it sent a violent shock of heat straight through her rigid spine. "I offer no poetry, Bryony," he said, using her Christian name for the first time. The sound of it on his tongue was blunt and heavy. "My life is demanding. It is cold and it is endlessly complicated, but I can offer you absolute security. Your mother's debts will be settled by nightfall. Your sister will have a dowry substantial enough to blind any man to her hardiness, and you will never, so long as you live, be forced to stand in the shadows of a ballroom again." Bryony looked down at his gloved hand resting against her arm, then up into his stormy, relentless eyes. She was a cynical woman. She knew marriages were transactions. Flesh traded for titles, youth traded for land. But this was not a purchase. This was a draft. He was conscripting her into his war. "You will not expect me to swoon," Bryony said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch, "or to pretend I am deeply in love with you. If you ever swoon, I shall assume you have taken ill and call for a physician." Algernon replied dryly, "And I would find feigned affection incredibly tedious." Bryony held his gaze. Her mind, usually a chaotic swirl of anxieties regarding butchers and bankruptcies, went perfectly, sharply clear. She looked at the harsh lines of his face, the ink smudge that was still faintly visible on his collar, the unyielding set of his shoulders. He was not a prince from a fairy tale. He was a tired general looking for a second in command. She could do that. She had been commanding a sinking ship for years. A duchy was merely a larger vessel. "My mother will require a cottage in Somerset," Bryony said, her voice perfectly even. "A comfortable one, with a roof that does not leak, and Christie must have her own season in London, away from my mother's incessant pacing." Algernon's mouth twitched, that same barely there shadow of amusement she had seen the night before. He recognized the negotiation for what it was. An acceptance. "Done," he said. "And I will require unrestricted access to the estate libraries," she added, pushing her advantage, a spark of genuine defiance returning to her eyes. "I will not be relegated to the drawing room to knit. I would burn the drawing room to the ground before I asked you to knit in it." Algernon swore quietly. He stepped back, dropping his hand from her arm. The cold air rushed back into the space between them, but the bone-deep chill of the morning had vanished. "I will speak to your mother immediately upon our return," Algernon said, adjusting the lapels of his coat. "We will be married in a fortnight by special license. I have no desire to endure a prolonged engagement." "A fortnight," Bryony repeated. The timeline was absurdly fast, a tactical strike rather than a courtship. It suited her perfectly. "Very well, Your Grace. Shall we return and inform Lady Reyes that she no longer needs to pawn her garnets?" Algernon offered his arm once more. "Let us go put the woman out of her misery, Miss Reyes." Bryony took his arm, turning back towards the suffocating reality of her townhouse. But for the first time in 3 years, she did not feel as though she were walking toward a prison. She felt as though she were walking toward a war room, and she was finally properly armed. Agatha was exactly where they had left her, standing rigid by the unlit hearth of the morning room, her fingers twisted into the frayed edge of her shawl. When the parlor door opened, her eyes darted immediately to Algernon, scanning his harsh features for a sign of salvation, before dragging her gaze to Bryony. Bryony untied her bonnet. She didn't offer a reassuring smile. She simply met her mother's frantic stare with calm, level certainty. "Lady Reyes," Algernon said, his voice filling the cramped space, leaving no room for preamble or misinterpretation. "I have asked Miss Bryony for her hand in marriage. She has consented. My man of business, Mr. Hopkins, will be here at noon to settle the entirety of your outstanding accounts. You are to instruct your maid to pack. You will be removing to a property in Somerset by the end of the week." Agatha stopped breathing. For 5 terrible seconds, she simply stared at the large, unsmiling Duke, her mind completely failing to process the architecture of the sentence he had just constructed. She looked at Christie, who was weeping silently in the corner, and then back at Bryony. "Bryony!" Agatha choked out, the words scraping against her vocal cords. Her hand flew to her throat. "But, Your Grace, surely you mean—" She pointed a trembling finger towards the petite, blonde girl by the window. "Christie is the one who—" "I mean exactly what I have said, madam," Algernon cut in. His tone was not raised, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that pinned Agatha to the floorboards. "I do not make miscalculations, and I do not mistake one sister for another. I am marrying Bryony." Agatha's legs gave out. She collapsed into the nearest armchair, a puff of stale dust rising from the ancient upholstery. She sat staring at the blank wall, her lips moving silently as she tried to calculate the impossible mathematics of a plain, dowdy spinster securing the most powerful peer in England. Algernon turned to Bryony. He did not ask for a private farewell, nor did he attempt to kiss her hand. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a heavy iron key. He held it out to her. "The library at the Mayfair house," he said quietly, ensuring only she could hear. "Hopkins will bring the estate ledgers this afternoon. The Durham mine is operating at a deficit. I expect your initial thoughts on the matter by tomorrow evening." Bryony took the key. The metal was cold and heavy in her palm. It was the most romantic thing she had ever been given. "You shall have them, Your Grace," she replied, a genuine rare spark of fire lighting her dark eyes. He nodded once, turned on his heel, and left the townhouse. The next 2 weeks were a blur of violent, unprecedented upheaval. Mr. Hopkins arrived precisely at noon, carrying a leather satchel that systematically dismantled 3 years of Agatha's terror. Butchers were paid. The landlord was silenced. A deed for a remarkably sturdy, ivy-covered cottage in Somerset was placed in Agatha's trembling hands, along with a draft establishing a dowry for Christie that made the younger girl gasp and drop her teacup. Bryony, however, did not participate in the frantic packing. She sat at the dining table, surrounded by towering stacks of Hawkhurst ledgers. She spent her days tracking grain yields, coal output, and tenant repairs. She sent Algernon stark, unsparing notes detailing the gross incompetence of his northern overseer. He replied with equally brief, ink-stained letters, authorizing her to draft the man's termination. They did not speak of love. They spoke of efficiency, and Bryony slept soundly for the first time in a decade. The Tun, however, did not sleep. The gossip spread through Mayfair like a cholera outbreak. The Duke of Hawkhurst was marrying Reyes, not the pretty one, the other one. The tall, scowling creature who hid behind plants. The rumors were vicious. She had trapped him in a compromising position. She was carrying his child. She had blackmailed him. Society, built entirely on the currency of beauty and wealth, could not fathom a transaction based on intellect and spine. On the Thursday before their wedding, Algernon's carriage arrived at the townhouse. He did not step out. Instead, Hopkins delivered a large, flat box wrapped in brown paper, accompanied by a note in Algernon's sharp, slashing hand. "Lady Jersey's ball tonight. It is time to let the vultures see what they are circling. The carriage will return at 8. Bryony opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a gown. It was not white. It was not adorned with lace or ruffles or any of the soft, simpering details required of a debutante. It was a gown of heavy, midnight blue velvet, cut with brutal architectural precision. It had long sleeves, a high, square neckline, and no embellishments save for a single, heavy silver clasp at the waist. It was armor. When Bryony stepped into the parlor that evening, Agatha physically recoiled. "You cannot wear that," her mother whispered, horrified. "It is too severe. You look like a queen going to an execution. You must soften your hair. Let me fetch Christie's pearl pins." "No," Bryony said flatly. She pulled her dark hair back into a tight, uncompromising knot at the base of her neck. "I am not trying to be soft, Mother. Soft things are easily crushed." Lady Jersey's ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and mirrored walls, designed specifically to reflect the inadequacies of its occupants. It was the apex of the London season, a glittering, ruthless arena where reputations were made and dismantled between waltzes. When Bryony stepped through the double doors, she was alone. Algernon had sent word he was detained in the House of Lords and would arrive shortly. He had offered to send Hopkins to escort her, but Bryony had refused. She would not hide behind a steward. The silence that rolled over the room was immediate and deafening. The string quartet continued to play, but the frantic hum of gossip ceased. Hundreds of faces turned toward the entrance. Bryony stood at the top of the short staircase, the midnight blue velvet drinking in the light of the chandeliers. She felt the collective weight of their disdain press against her chest. She saw the sneers behind feathered fans. She heard the harsh, whispered appraisals. "Look at her. So severe. Plain as a post. A pity match. The Duke is merely settling a gambling debt to her late father," I heard. Bryony did not flinch. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her shoulders locked back, and descended the stairs. She did not seek out the corners. She did not look for a fern. She walked directly toward the center of the room, parting the sea of silk and satin by the sheer force of her unyielding posture. Lady Cowper, a woman who wielded her social influence like a poisoned blade, detached herself from a group of tittering debutantes and stepped directly into Bryony's path. Miss Reyes," Lady Cowper drawled, her gaze raking over Bryony's unadorned velvet gown with theatrical pity. Or should I say the future Duchess of Hawkhurst? We were all quite startled by the announcement. It is so rare to see a woman of your particular age and disposition secure such a prominent name. One wonders what sort of arrangement was made behind closed doors. A low ripple of cruel laughter echoed from the debutantes behind her. Bryony looked down at the older woman. She did not flush. She did not stammer. She felt the heavy iron key resting in the pocket of her cloak in the cloakroom, a physical reminder of the power she already wielded. "The arrangement, Lady Cowper, is quite simple," Bryony said, her voice carrying clearly over the scraping violins. "The Duke required a wife who does not bore him to tears with idle, malicious gossip. I fit the criteria perfectly." Lady Cowper's face mottled a furious, ugly red. Before she could unleash a venomous retort, a sudden commotion at the entrance drew every eye in the room. Algernon had arrived. He did not pause at the top of the stairs. He did not greet his hostess. He moved through the crowded ballroom with the lethal, singular focus of a predator tracking a scent. The aristocrats scrambled to get out of his way, clearing a wide, empty path straight across the polished floor. He was in formal evening wear, a stark black tailcoat that emphasized his broad chest and the grim, unsmiling set of his jaw. He looked exhausted, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to the glittering spectacle around him. His grey eyes locked onto Bryony. He ignored the beautiful, titled women thrusting themselves into his peripheral vision. He walked straight past a stunning earl's daughter who practically threw herself into a curtsy. He did not even blink. He reached the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Bryony and Lady Cowper. Algernon did not look at Lady Cowper. He looked only at his fiancée. He took in the severe midnight velvet, the severe hair, the proud, defiant angle of her chin. The tension in his massive shoulders instantly vanished. You did not wait for me," he murmured, his low voice wrapping around her, entirely ignoring the hundreds of people staring at them. "You were debating the Corn Laws, Your Grace," Bryony replied, the tightness in her chest finally dissolving. "I did not think agriculture should wait upon a waltz." The corner of his mouth curved upward. It was a real, tangible smile, stark and beautiful on his harsh face. The collective gasp from the surrounding matrons was audible. The Duke of Hawkhurst did not smile. Algernon finally turned his head, fixing his cold, slate-grey eyes on Lady Cowper. The hostility in his gaze was absolute. "Lady Cowper," he said softly, "I trust you are congratulating my future Duchess, a woman whose intellect outstrips every man in my parliamentary cohort, and whose patience for foolishness is blessedly non-existent." Lady Cowper swallowed hard, her malicious confidence evaporating under the crushing weight of a duke's open contempt. Of course, Your Grace. A brilliant match." Algernon turned back to Bryony. He stepped into her space, entirely violating the strict rules of polite distance. He lifted his hand and slowly, deliberately, removed the pristine white evening glove from his right hand, tucking it into his waistcoat. Then he held his bare hand out to her. It was a staggering breach of etiquette. A duke did not touch a woman bare-handed on a dance floor before the vows were spoken. It was an intimate, possessive claim, broadcast to the entire ruling class of England. "The musicians are playing a waltz, Bryony," he said, his voice ringing with quiet, absolute command. "And I have had a very long day." Bryony looked at his outstretched hand, the calluses from the riding reins, the faint ink stain that never seemed to fully wash away. She placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, unyielding grip of iron and security. He pulled her onto the floor. They did not float. They moved with heavy, grounded power. Algernon kept her closer than was strictly proper, his hand a solid, immovable weight against the velvet at her waist. As they turned, Bryony looked over his broad shoulder. She saw her mother standing near the doorway, her hands clamped over her mouth in sheer, trembling awe. She saw the debutantes, their cruel whispers silenced, staring with wide, envious eyes at the plain, proud wallflower being held by the most powerful man in the room. They weren't looking past her anymore. Algernon had forced the entire world to stop and look at her. "They are staring," Bryony murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his cravat. "Let them stare," Algernon replied, his thumb pressing firmly into the curve of her spine. "They are looking at a fortress. Let them realize the gates are closed to them." Bryony finally looked up into his stormy eyes. The cynicism that had defined her entire life fractured, replaced by a fierce, undeniable loyalty to this exhausted, brilliant man. He had not chosen her despite her flaws. He had chosen her because of them. She was plain, she was proud, and she was exactly what he wanted. 3 days later, they married in a freezing, echoing chapel in Mayfair. No floral arrangements adorned the dark oak pews. No choir lifted their voices to the vaulted ceiling. The ceremony was brutally efficient, devoid of the suffocating pageantry that society demanded. Bryony wore a tailored walking dress of heavy charcoal wool. It was entirely unromantic and perfectly suited for the biting chill of the stone sanctuary. Algernon wore his customary black. He stood at the altar with the rigid posture of a soldier awaiting orders, his broad shoulders blocking the weak morning light filtering through the stained glass. Agatha sat in the front pew, weeping silently into a lace handkerchief. Her tears were a chaotic mixture of residual terror, profound relief, and sheer, baffled incomprehension. Christie sat beside her, swathed in her new, expensive furs, looking bewildered but undeniably safe. When the vicar asked for the vows, Algernon did not hesitate. His voice, low, gravelly, and entirely steady, bounced off the cold stone walls. He did not recite the words like a poem, he delivered them like a binding legal decree. When it was Bryony's turn, she met his slate-grey eyes. She did not lower her head. She spoke her vows with the same unyielding clarity. He slipped a band of thick, unadorned gold onto her left hand. It carried an immense weight. It felt exactly like a manacle of absolute, unbreakable security. They did not hold a wedding breakfast. They did not wave to a crowd of well-wishers. Algernon handed Agatha the final deed to the Somerset cottage, nodded once to Christie, and handed his new wife into a waiting carriage bearing the ducal crest. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside the plush, leather-scented interior. The carriage lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cobblestones, carrying them away from the toxic, desperate orbit of the marriage mart forever. Algernon slumped back against the velvet squabs and closed his eyes. The punishing exhaustion that seemed permanently carved into the lines of his face was stark in the dim carriage light. He did not attempt to hold her hand. He did not offer a gentle, husbandly platitude. Hopkins left the Durham reports on the desk in my study. Algernon muttered, his eyes still closed. The overseer's ledger is a work of absolute fiction. He is inflating the cost of the timber supports by at least 20%. Bryony leaned back against her own seat, adjusting the heavy wool of her skirt. A strange, fierce warmth bloomed in her chest. A lesser woman would have been insulted, weeping over the lack of romance on her wedding day. Bryony felt only a profound, grounding relief. He was not treating her like a fragile porcelain doll that needed to be humoured. He was treating her like his equal. "Then we shall audit the timber merchants in Newcastle," Bryony replied, evenly, watching the grey blur of London buildings pass through the window. "If they are colluding with him, we will sever the contracts and source the wood directly from your own forests in the north." Algernon's eyes snapped open. He turned his head to look at her. The exhaustion receded, replaced by that familiar, piercing intellect. A slow, genuine smile spread across his harsh features. "My forests," he corrected softly. "They are your forests now, Bryony." When they arrived at the colossal, imposing Mayfair townhouse, Algernon bypassed the grand drawing rooms and the nervous line of waiting servants entirely. He took Bryony by the elbow and steered her straight into his private study. It was a masculine, chaotic space, smelling heavily of cigar smoke, leather bindings, and spilled ink. Massive oak desks groaned under the weight of parliamentary bills and estate ledgers. It was a war room. Algernon shed his heavy driving coat, tossing it carelessly over the back of a leather chair. He walked to a sideboard, poured 2 generous measures of amber liquid into crystal tumblers, and handed one to Bryony. "To the fortress," he said, raising his glass. "To the fortress," she echoed. The whiskey burned like liquid fire down her throat, settling into a hot, steady knot in her stomach. They spent their wedding night sitting on opposite sides of a massive mahogany desk, a single oil lamp illuminating the columns of numbers. Bryony worked systematically, her sharp mind cutting through the overseer's fraudulent arithmetic with ruthless precision. Algernon watched her. He did not read his own papers. He simply sat in the shadows, sipping his whiskey, watching his wife dismantle a corrupt operation with nothing but a quill and a frown. Hours passed. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing red embers. The quiet intimacy of the room was thicker than any physical embrace. Finally, Bryony set her quill down and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "He has embezzled nearly £3,000 over 2 years, Algernon. It is hidden in the transportation costs. He claims the rail lines are charging a premium, but the dates do not align with the freight schedules." She looked up. Algernon was standing right beside her chair. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace for a man of his size. She hadn't even heard him cross the rug. He reached down and gently removed the ink-stained quill from her fingers. He dropped it onto the ledger. "The overseer is terminated," Algernon said, his voice a low rumble, vibrating in the quiet room. He placed his large, calloused hands on the armrests of her chair, boxing her in, bringing his face level with hers. "We will send the magistrates to Newcastle in the morning." Bryony looked at his hands, then up into his stormy eyes. The professional distance was gone. The raw, heavy gravity of his presence pulled at her, sudden and overwhelming. "The magistrates will require the compiled evidence," she whispered, her pulse finally accelerating, a rapid, frantic thud against her ribs. "Hopkins can compile the evidence," Algernon murmured. He leaned in, entirely invading her space. He smelled of whiskey, smoke, and sheer uncompromising male heat. "You are my wife, Bryony. You have balanced my ledgers. I believe it is time you occupied my bed." There was no poetry in his demand, no flowery seduction. It was a blunt, grounded statement of fact. And it was exactly what she wanted. Bryony reached up, her fingers gripping the lapels of his stark black coat. She pulled him down. When his mouth met hers, it was not gentle. It was a collision. It was hungry, heavy, and desperate, a release of the immense pressure they both carried. He kissed her like a starving man who had finally found sustenance, his hands sliding from the chair to grip her waist, pulling her up against his solid, unyielding frame. Bryony kissed him back with equal ferocity. She poured every ounce of her cynical, practical soul into the embrace, anchoring him to the floor, proving in physical, undeniable terms that she would not bend, she would not break, and she would never, ever retreat. Winter descended on Derbyshire with violent, unforgiving force. The snow piled high against the colossal stone walls of Hawkhurst, turning the estate into an isolated, freezing island in a sea of white. It was exactly as Algernon had promised. It was massive, imposing, and brutally drafty. Bryony did not complain. She went to war. Within a month, the grand house was fundamentally transformed. She fired the indolent housekeeper, promoted a sharp-eyed maid from the scullery, and ordered every chimney swept and every rattling window sealed with heavy velvet drapery. She tore through the estate kitchens, auditing the larder and ending decades of petty theft by the local grocers. The servants, initially terrified of the tall, severe, new Duchess who rarely smiled and missed absolutely nothing, soon realized they were being paid on time for the first time in 5 years. The fear morphed into a fierce, protective loyalty. Algernon remained in London for the final grueling session of Parliament. His letters arrived twice a week, short, ink-smudged missives detailing political betrayals, voting counts, and, occasionally, a single sentence demanding she stay warm. Bryony replied with meticulous accounts of the estate's progress, the coal yields, and the exact volume of wool sheared from his damp sheep. It was mid-December when the carriage finally breached the snowdrifts of the main drive. Bryony was in the estate library, standing on a wooden ladder, attempting to catalogue a row of crumbling botanical texts. The heavy oak doors swung open. Algernon stood in the threshold. He looked terrible. His face was grey with fatigue, his jaw covered in dark stubble, and his heavy coat was caked in melting snow. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, his chest heaving, his grey eyes scanning the warm, fire-lit room until they locked on to her. Bryony dropped the book she was holding. It hit the carpet with a heavy thud. She's practically jumped off the ladder, ignoring the jarring impact on her knees, and crossed the room. Algernon caught her. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his cold face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her hair like it was oxygen. He held her so tightly her ribs ached, his massive frame trembling slightly from exhaustion and the brutal cold. They passed the reforms. He rasped against her skin, his voice cracked and dry. It took 3 weeks of endless screaming debate, but the votes held. Bryony wrapped her arms around his broad back, holding him up, grounding his weight. You won. I survived, he corrected, pulling back slightly to look at her face. His eyes roamed over her features. She wore no makeup. Her dark hair was pinned back in its usual severe knot. She wore a practical, heavy gown of dark green wool. She was the absolute antithesis of the glittering, delicate debutantes he had spent the last month dodging in London drawing rooms. My mother is a fool, Bryony said softly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, quoting him from the night they met. Algernon let out a rough, sudden laugh, the sound cracking the heavy fatigue on his face. He reached up, his gloved thumb tracing the strong, sharp angle of her jaw. Society called you plain, Algernon murmured, his grey eyes darkening with a fierce, possessive intensity. They looked at you and saw nothing of value. They are fools, Bryony. The whole damned world is blind. I am plain, Algernon, she replied, entirely unbothered by the fact. You are magnificent, he countered bluntly, stepping forward, backing her against the edge of a mahogany reading table. You are the only real thing in a world built on paper and lies. You took a crumbling, freezing monstrosity of an estate and made it a home. You took a man drowning in ledgers and gave him a partner. He leaned down, kissing her slowly, deeply, the cold from his journey melting rapidly against the heat of her mouth. It was a kiss of profound, unshakable devotion. When he finally pulled away, Algernon rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes, simply existing in the quiet, secure space she had carved out for him. I am not returning to London until the spring, he stated, leaving no room for argument. I refuse to sleep in another bed that does not contain you, and I refuse to eat another meal where I am not looking at you from across the table. Bryony reached up, threading her fingers through his damp, snow-flecked hair. The cynicism that had defined her youth was entirely gone, replaced by the heavy, immovable architecture of their shared life. She had entered the marriage mart as a piece of undesirable inventory. She had emerged as the undisputed commander of a northern fortress. Then you shall stay in Derbyshire, Your Grace, Bryony said quietly, the fierce, protective light in her dark eyes matching his own. We have timber to sell, coal to mine, and a great deal of draughty bedrooms to keep warm. Algernon smiled, a true, brilliant expression that belonged exclusively to her, and pulled his Duchess back into his arms. Thank you for listening to the beginning of Bryony and Algernon's story. If you felt the tension in that ballroom and want to see how this plain, proud wallflower brings a weary duke to his knees, please hit the like button and share this video with your fellow romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter of this slow-burn Regency drama. Let me know in the comments what you think Agatha will do next.